As the first-class cabin erupted in chaos, Sergeant Tamara Johnson stood her ground. One man's refusal to sit next to her would ignite a firestorm, challenging a nation's conscience. In the next 24 hours, this soldier's quiet dignity would spark a movement, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon against hate is unwavering resolve.
I never thought my journey home would turn into a national controversy. But that's exactly what happened on what should have been a routine flight from Atlanta to San Francisco. I'm Sergeant Tamara Johnson, and this is my story. After 6 grueling months stationed in the Middle East, all I wanted was to get back to my family. The anticipation of hugging my kids and kissing my husband had been the only thing keeping me going during those long, sweltering days. As I boarded the plane in my uniform, I felt a mix of exhaustion and excitement. Little did I know, this flight would change my life in ways I never expected. I made my way down the aisle, nodding politely to fellow passengers. Some smiled back. A few even thanked me for my service. It was a small gesture, but it always warmed my heart. As I approached my seat in economy class, a flight attendant stopped me. "Excuse me, Sergeant," she said with a warm smile. "We have an available seat in first class. It's airline policy to upgrade active duty military personnel when possible. Would you like to move up?" I was taken aback. In all my years of service, I'd never been offered such an upgrade. "Are you sure?" I asked, not wanting to impose. "Absolutely," she assured me. "It's the least we can do to thank you for your service. Please, follow me." As we made our way to the front of the plane, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not because of the upgrade itself, but because of what it represented. A tangible acknowledgement of the sacrifices made by service members like myself. The flight attendant led me to an empty aisle seat in the first row of first class. As I began to settle in, storing my small backpack under the seat in front of me, I heard a commotion from the seat next to mine. "Excuse me," a gruff voice said. "I think there's been some mistake." I looked up to see a middle-aged white man in an expensive-looking suit, his face contorted in what I can only describe as barely concealed disgust. He was addressing the flight attendant, but his eyes kept darting towards me. "There's no mistake, sir," the attendant replied calmly. "This seat was available, and we've upgraded Sergeant Johnson as per our policy for active duty military personnel." The man's face reddened. But I paid for first class," he sputtered. "I don't think it's fair that someone who didn't pay gets to sit here." I felt my chest tighten. I'd faced my fair share of discrimination before, but something about this man's tone and the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. I wanted to speak up, to defend myself, but years of military discipline held me back. I knew escalating the situation wouldn't help anyone. The flight attendant, however, wasn't backing down. "Sir, our policy is clear. We honor our military personnel when we can. Sergeant Johnson's presence here doesn't diminish your first-class experience in any way." But the man wasn't having it. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice, but not enough that I couldn't hear every word. "Look," he hissed, "I'm not trying to be difficult, but I paid a premium for this seat. I don't think it's right that someone like her gets to sit here for free." The implication in his words was clear as day. This wasn't just about the money or the seat. This was about the color of my skin. I felt a familiar knot form in my stomach. It was the same feeling I'd had countless times before. In school, during training, even on the battlefield. That feeling of being seen as less than, of not belonging, simply because of who I am. The flight attendant's face hardened. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voice. Sergeant Johnson has every right to be here, and I won't tolerate any discriminatory language or behavior on this flight." By now, other passengers were starting to take notice. I could feel their eyes on us, hear their whispers. Some looked concerned, others curious, and a few seemed downright angry, though I couldn't tell if that anger was directed at me or the man beside me. I wanted to disappear. Here I was, fresh from serving my country, and I was being made to feel like an intruder. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd faced less hostility in war zones than I was facing on this plane in my own country. As the tension mounted, I considered offering to move back to economy. It wasn't worth all this trouble, I thought. But then I remembered something my grandmother used to tell me. Never let anyone make you feel small. You have every right to take up space in this world. So I sat there, straight-backed and silent, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. The man continued to argue with the flight attendant, his voice getting louder and more agitated by the minute. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "I want to speak to the captain. This is discrimination against paying customers." The flight attendant remained impressively composed. "Sir, the captain is preparing for takeoff. I assure you, this decision is final. Now, I'm going to have to insist that you lower your voice and stop disturbing other passengers." As this exchange continued, I noticed something happening around me. Other passengers in first class, who had initially seemed content to ignore the situation, were starting to speak up. "Leave her alone," a woman across the aisle said firmly. "She's serving our country. Show some respect." An elderly man a few rows back chimed in. "Young man, I fought in Vietnam, and I can tell you that soldier deserves this seat more than any of us." Suddenly, I wasn't alone anymore. These strangers were standing up for me, defending my right to be there. It was a powerful moment, one that brought tears to my eyes. The man, realizing he was losing support, changed tactics. "Look," he said, addressing me directly for the first time. "I'm sorry if I offended you. I respect our troops, I really do. It's just, I paid a lot for this seat, and it doesn't seem fair." I took a deep breath, gathering my courage. "Sir," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "I understand your frustration, but this isn't about fairness. It's about respect. Respect for the sacrifices made by all service members, regardless of their race or background. I didn't ask for this seat, but I won't be shamed for accepting it either." A hush fell over the first-class cabin. The man stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. For a moment, I thought he might actually apologize. Instead, he turned to the flight attendant. "Fine," he growled. "If you won't move her, then move me. I refuse to sit next to someone who doesn't belong here." His words hit me like a physical blow. I'd faced racism before, but rarely so blatant, so unapologetic. In that moment, all the exhaustion, stress, and homesickness I'd been holding back came crashing down on me. But before I could react, something extraordinary happened. If you're as outraged by this injustice as I am, please hit that subscribe button. Together, we can shine a light on these issues and work towards a more inclusive society. The entire first-class cabin erupted in a chorus of boos and angry shouts. Passengers I'd never met before were defending me, calling out the man's behavior for what it was: blatant racism. "You're the one who doesn't belong here. Get off the plane if you can't treat people with respect. Thank you for your service, Sergeant." The support was overwhelming. In all my years of service, I'd never felt so simultaneously vulnerable and protected. Here I was, a stranger to these people, and they were rallying around me like I was family. As the commotion grew, I saw the flight attendant speaking urgently into her phone. Moments later, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been made aware of a disturbance in the first-class cabin. I want to remind everyone that discriminatory behavior of any kind is not tolerated on this airline. We will not take off until this situation is resolved." The man's face turned an even deeper shade of red. He looked around wildly, as if searching for someone, anyone, to take his side. But he found no allies here. Finally, defeated, he stood up. "Fine, he muttered. "I'll move, but I want a full refund for this flight." As he gathered his things, pointedly avoiding eye contact with anyone, another flight attendant approached. "Sir, please follow me. We've arranged for you to take a seat in economy class." A ripple of satisfaction went through the cabin. It felt like justice, in a small but significant way. As the man was led away, passengers around me started to introduce themselves. A kind-faced woman in the row behind me leaned forward. "I'm so sorry you had to go through that," she said, her eyes full of genuine concern. No one should ever be treated that way, especially not someone who's risking their life for our country. I felt a lump form in my throat. "Thank you," I managed to say. "It means more than you know." For the next few minutes, as the crew prepared for takeoff, I was showered with words of support and gratitude from my fellow passengers. People shared their own stories of facing discrimination, of standing up against injustice. It was a powerful reminder that for every person who tries to tear you down, there are many more ready to build you up. As the plane finally began to taxi down the runway, I leaned back in my seat, emotionally drained but oddly uplifted. This wasn't how I'd imagined starting my journey home, but in a strange way, it had renewed my faith in humanity. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. The events that would unfold over the next few hours would not only change my life, but spark a national conversation about race, respect, and what it truly means to serve one's country. As the plane leveled off at cruising altitude, I found myself replaying the events of the past hour in my mind. The confrontation, the support from strangers, the man's eventual removal from first class. It all felt surreal. I was grateful for the kindness shown to me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was far from over. I was right. About 30 minutes into the flight, I noticed a flurry of activity among the flight attendants. They were huddled near the galley, speaking in hushed tones and casting furtive glances in my direction. My military training kicked in, and I felt my senses heighten. Something was up. Finally, one of the attendants approached me. Her name tag read Sarah, and she had a look of concern on her face. "Sergeant Johnson," she said quietly, leaning in close. "I hate to bother you, but we have a situation developing." My heart sank. "What kind of situation?" I asked, already dreading the answer. Sarah took a deep breath. "The passenger we moved to economy, he's causing problems. He's been loudly complaining about reverse racism and special treatment. Some passengers are getting upset, and we're worried things might escalate." I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to center myself. Of course, it couldn't be that simple. Of course, he couldn't just accept the consequences of his actions and move on. "What do you need from me?" I asked, even though I had a feeling I knew what was coming. "We were hoping you might be willing to speak with him," Sarah said, her expression apologetic. "Maybe if he hears directly from you, he'll understand and calm down. We don't want to have to divert the flight, but if this continues..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood the gravity of the situation. A diverted flight would mean delays for everyone, potential legal issues, and who knows what other complications. As much as I wanted to just enjoy my flight in peace, I knew I had a responsibility to try and diffuse this situation. "All right," I said, steeling myself. "I'll talk to him." Sarah looked relieved. "Thank you, Sergeant. We really appreciate your help." As I stood up to follow her, I noticed several passengers watching me with concern. The woman who had spoken to me earlier caught my eye. "Is everything okay?" she asked. I managed a small smile. "I hope it will be," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Sarah led me to the economy section. As we approached, I could hear the man's voice, loud and indignant, before I could see him. "This is a disgrace," he was saying. "I paid for first class, and they gave my seat to someone who didn't pay a dime. How is that fair?" I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm and professional. As we reached his row, I could see the discomfort on the faces of the passengers around him. Some were trying to ignore him, while others were openly glaring. The man's eyes widened when he saw me. "Oh, look who it is," he sneered. "Come to gloat, have you?" I squared my shoulders, channeling every ounce of authority I'd learned in the military. "Sir," I said, keeping my voice level, "I'd like to speak with you privately if possible. Perhaps we could step into the galley area." He scoffed, but after a moment's hesitation, unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. I could feel the eyes of every passenger in the vicinity on us as we made our way to the rear galley. Once we were relatively secluded, I turned to face him. Up close, I could see the flush of anger on his face, the way his hands trembled slightly. This wasn't just about a seat upgrade, I realized. This man was carrying a lot of anger, and for some reason I had become the target of it all. "Sir," I began, "I understand you're upset about losing your first-class seat. I want you to know that I never intended to cause any trouble. The airline made that decision based on their policy, not because of anything I did or said." The man's jaw clenched. "It's not about the seat," he spat. "It's about fairness. It's about earning what you get. I worked hard for that seat, and you just waltz in and take it because of some misguided sense of political correctness." I took a deep breath, reminding myself to stay calm. "With all due respect, sir, you don't know anything about me or what I've earned. I've spent the last 6 months in a war zone, away from my family, risking my life to protect the freedoms we all enjoy, including the freedom to fly on this plane without fear." For a moment, I saw something flicker in his eyes, a hint of shame perhaps, but it was quickly replaced by defiance. "Look," he said, his voice lowering, "I'm not saying you don't deserve respect, but this preferential treatment, it's a slippery slope. Today it's airline seats, tomorrow it's jobs, college admissions. Where does it end?" I felt a surge of frustration. How could I make him understand? "Sir, this isn't about preferential treatment. It's about recognizing sacrifice. Every day, men and women of all races put their lives on the line for this country. The least we can do is offer them a comfortable seat on a flight home." He shook his head, unconvinced. "You don't get it. This is how it starts. Give an inch and they'll take a mile. I've worked hard all my life and I'm tired of being made to feel guilty for my success." Suddenly, I understood. This wasn't really about me at all. This man was fighting against a perceived threat to his status, his privilege. And in his mind, I represented that threat. "Sir," I said, softening my tone, "no one is trying to take anything away from you. Your success doesn't diminish because someone else is recognized. There's room for all of us to succeed, to be comfortable, to be respected." For a moment, I thought I saw a crack in his armor. But then his face hardened again. "Sure easy for you to say," he muttered. "You're probably used to getting handouts." The words stung, but I refused to let him see how much they affected me. Instead, I decided to try a different approach. "Let me ask you something," I said. "Do you have children?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Yes," he replied cautiously. "2 daughters." I nodded. "And I'm sure you want the best for them, right? You want them to live in a world where they're judged by their character and their actions, not by their appearance or background?" He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "That's all any of us want," I continued. "A fair chance. The opportunity to prove ourselves. When you look at me, you see a black woman who got a free upgrade. But what you should see is a soldier, a mother, a citizen who has dedicated her life to serving this country, just like you want your daughters to be seen for who they are, not what they look like." I could see my words were having an impact. The anger in his eyes was fading, replaced by something that looked a lot like uncertainty. I never thought about it like that," he admitted quietly. Just then, A commotion from the main cabin caught our attention. We both turned to see a group of passengers gathered around someone's phone, expressions of shock and excitement on their faces. Sarah, the flight attendant, rushed over to us. "Sergeant Johnson," she said, her voice urgent, "you need to see this." She held out her phone, and I felt my stomach drop as I saw what was on the screen. It was a social media post, already going viral, with a blurry photo of me and the man arguing in first class. The caption read, "Racist passenger tries to deny seat to black soldier. What happened next will restore your faith in humanity." The post had thousands of shares and comments already, and it was spreading fast. I looked up at the man, seeing the color drain from his face as he realized the implications. "Oh God," he whispered. "What have I done?" As the reality of the situation sank in, I realized that this flight was just the beginning. What had started as a personal confrontation was about to become a national conversation. And like it or not, I was going to be at the center of it all. The next few hours would test me in ways I never expected. But as I stood there in that cramped airplane galley, facing a man who had gone from my antagonist to a reluctant ally in the face of public scrutiny, I knew one thing for certain. This was a battle I couldn't walk away from. Not just for myself, but for every service member who had ever felt out of place, every person who had ever been judged by the color of their skin rather than the content of their character. As we made our way back to our seats, the plane buzzing with the news of our viral fame, I steeled myself for what was to come. This wasn't the homecoming I had imagined, but maybe, just maybe, it was the one I was meant to have. A chance to make a difference, to change minds, to bridge the divide that seemed to be growing wider every day in our country. Little did I know, the real challenge was yet to come. As we began our descent into San Francisco, I had no idea that the next 24 hours would change not just my life, but the lives of millions of Americans. The conversation that started on this flight was about to ignite a national debate, and I was about to find myself at the very heart of it. As the plane touched down in San Francisco, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The flight had been an emotional roller coaster, but I knew the real challenge was just beginning. My phone had been buzzing nonstop since we'd been allowed to turn on our devices, and I dreaded looking at the flood of notifications. The moment we taxied to the gate, I could see the commotion through the small oval window. There was a crowd gathered just beyond the terminal, and I caught glimpses of news vans and cameras. My heart sank. How had this escalated so quickly? The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived at San Francisco International Airport. However, I must ask you to remain seated. We have a situation outside that needs to be addressed before we can deplane." A collective groan went up from the passengers, but I noticed many eyes turning towards me. They knew. Somehow, they all knew that this situation was because of what had happened on our flight. Sarah, the flight attendant who had been so helpful earlier, approached me. "Sergeant Johnson," she said quietly, "there are some people who'd like to speak with you before you leave the plane. Is that all right?" I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. As I stood to follow her, I felt a hand on my arm. It was the man from earlier, the one who had caused all this trouble in the first place. I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for this to happen." I looked at him, seeing the genuine remorse in his eyes. "I know," I replied. "Let's just hope we can make something good come out of this." As Sarah led me towards the front of the plane, I could hear the murmurs of the other passengers. Some were supportive, others curious, and a few seemed annoyed at the delay. I kept my head high, channeling every ounce of military bearing I possessed. At the front of the plane, I was met by a group of people in suits, airline executives from the looks of it. A woman stepped forward, introducing herself as the VP of Customer Relations. "Sergeant Johnson," she said, her voice a mix of concern and forced cheerfulness. "We want to apologize for any discomfort you experienced on this flight. We're prepared to offer you compensation and— I held up a hand, cutting her off. Ma'am, with all due respect, I'm not interested in compensation. What happened today isn't just about me or this airline. It's about a bigger issue that needs to be addressed. The executives exchanged glances, clearly unprepared for this response. The VP cleared her throat. Of course we understand, but perhaps we could discuss this further in private? There's quite a media presence outside, and we'd like to manage this situation carefully. I felt a surge of frustration. Manage the situation? This isn't a PR problem to be managed. This is a chance to have a real conversation about racism and respect in this country. Just then, my phone buzzed again. I glanced down to see a text from my husband. Honey, are you okay? It's all over the news. The kids and I are worried. Reality came crashing down on me. In all the chaos, I'd almost forgotten about my family waiting for me. They must be so confused and concerned. I took a deep breath, trying to center myself. Look, I said to the airline executives, I appreciate your concern, but right now I need to see my family. They're waiting for me, and they deserve to hear what happened from me first. The VP nodded, though she looked less than pleased. Of course, we'll have an escort take you through a private exit to avoid the media. As we made our way off the plane, I could feel the eyes of every passenger on me. Some nodded in support, others looked away awkwardly. The man who had started all this caught my eye as I passed. He mouthed a silent, "Thank you," and I gave him a small nod in return. The walk through the terminal was surreal. Airport security flanked me on all sides, keeping the press and curious onlookers at bay. I could hear shouted questions and the click of cameras, but I kept my eyes forward, focused on the exit where I knew my family would be waiting. And then, suddenly, there they were. My husband John, looking worried but relieved, and my two children, Aisha and Marcus, their eyes wide with a mix of confusion and excitement. I broke into a run, security be damned. John caught me in his arms, holding me tight as the kids wrapped themselves around my legs. For a moment, the world faded away, and I was just a soldier coming home to her family. Mom, are you a superhero now? Marcus asked, his voice muffled against my uniform. I couldn't help but laugh, even as I felt tears pricking at my eyes. No, baby. I'm just your mom who had a very strange day. John pulled back, cupping my face in his hands. Tamara, what happened? We've been seeing all these stories online, but they don't make any sense. I sighed, feeling the weight of the day settling on my shoulders. It's a long story, honey. Can we go home? I'll explain everything there. As we made our way to the car, I could see the news vans following us, reporters shouting questions. John did his best to shield the kids, but I knew we couldn't hide from this. Whatever was coming, we'd have to face it as a family. The drive home was tense. I gave John and the kids a brief rundown of what had happened on the flight, trying to keep it simple for the children's sake. Aisha, always perceptive beyond her years, asked, "But Mom, why did that man not want you to sit in first class? Was it because you're a soldier?" I exchanged a glance with John in the rearview mirror. How do you explain systemic racism to a 10-year-old? No, sweetie, I said carefully. I think it was because of the color of my skin. The car fell silent. Even Marcus, usually full of energy, seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. When we finally pulled into our driveway, I was shocked to see a small crowd gathered. Neighbors, friends, even a few local reporters. Word had spread fast. John squeezed my hand. You don't have to talk to anyone if you don't want to. We can go straight inside. I took a deep breath, looking at my children in the back seat. They were watching me, waiting to see what I would do. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about the world they would grow up in, the challenges they might face. No, I said, straightening my uniform. I think I need to say something. As we stepped out of the car, the crowd surged forward. I held up my hands, asking for quiet. To my surprise, they listened. "I know you all have questions," I began, my voice steadier than I felt, "and I promise I'll address them. But first, I want to say this. What happened today on that flight isn't just about one incident or one person. It's about the work we still have to do as a nation to overcome prejudice and discrimination." I could see phones recording, people nodding along. I continued, "I've served this country proudly for years, alongside men and women of all races and backgrounds. And what I've learned is that our strength lies in our diversity, in our ability to come together despite our differences." As I spoke, I saw more people joining the crowd. Some were holding up signs of support, others just listening intently. "We have a choice to make," I said, my voice growing stronger. "We can let incidents like this divide us further, or we can use them as an opportunity to have honest conversations about race, respect, and what it truly means to be an American." I felt John's hand on my back, supporting me. The kids stood close, watching with a mix of pride and awe. "I don't have all the answers," I admitted. "But I'm willing to be part of the conversation, and I hope you all are too." As I finished speaking, there was a moment of silence. Then, slowly, applause began to build. People were nodding, some were wiping away tears. I even saw a few of my neighbors hugging each other. In that moment, standing in front of my home with my family by my side, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, some good could come out of this after all. But as the applause died down and the questions began, I knew this was just the beginning. The next few days would be crucial. How would the airline respond? What would the man from the flight do? And how would the nation react to this story? As I ushered my family inside, promising to answer more questions later, I couldn't shake the feeling that something big was starting, something that would challenge me in ways I'd never imagined. But looking at my children's faces, I knew it was a challenge I had to accept, for them, for myself, and for the country I'd sworn to protect. Little did I know, the events of the next 24 hours would test that resolve in ways I could never have anticipated. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing incessantly. As I reached for it, the events of the previous day came rushing back. I had barely slept, tossing and turning as I replayed every moment of that fateful flight in my mind. I unlocked my phone to find it flooded with notifications. Missed calls, text messages, social media alerts. It was overwhelming. But one notification stood out. A voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. With a mix of curiosity and trepidation, I pressed play. The voice that came through was familiar, but it took me a moment to place it. It was him, the man from the flight. "Sergeant Johnson," he began, his voice hesitant. "This is Robert Carlson. I wanted to apologize again for my behavior on the flight. I've been doing a lot of thinking, and I realize now how wrong I was. I was wondering if we could meet. I think I need to make this right." I sat there stunned. This was unexpected, to say the least. As I contemplated my response, John walked in, a concerned look on his face. "Honey, you might want to come downstairs," he said. "There's something you need to see." I followed him to our living room where the TV was on. My breath caught in my throat as I saw my own face plastered across the screen. The headline read, "Soldiers Stand, Viral Video Sparks National Debate on Racism." The news anchor was mid-sentence. The video, which has now been viewed over 10 million times, shows Sergeant Tamara Johnson calmly addressing a passenger who refused to sit next to her in first class. The airline has issued a statement condemning the passenger's behavior and reaffirming their commitment to diversity and inclusion. I sank onto the couch, my mind reeling. This was bigger than I had imagined. As I watched, the screen changed to show various social media posts. People from all walks of life were sharing their own experiences with racism, using the hashtag #DasIStandWithGT Johnson. John sat beside me, taking my hand. "What do you want to do?" he asked softly. I took a deep breath, thinking of Robert Carlson's voicemail. I think I need to meet with him. The man from the flight. John looked surprised. Are you sure that's a good idea? I nodded slowly. If there's a chance to turn this into something positive, I have to try. This isn't just about me anymore. Over the next few hours, I worked with John to craft a response to Robert. We agreed to meet at a local community center, a neutral ground that would hopefully provide some privacy from the media frenzy. As we pulled up to the community center that afternoon, I was struck by the crowd that had gathered. There were supporters holding signs, reporters with cameras, and even a few protesters. It was surreal to think that all of this was because of what had happened on that flight. Inside, Robert was already waiting. He looked different from the angry man I'd encountered on the plane, smaller somehow, more vulnerable. When he saw me, he stood up, his hands fidgeting nervously. "Sergeant Johnson," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," I nodded, taking a seat across from him. "Mr. Carlson, I appreciate you reaching out. I think we have a lot to discuss." For the next hour, Robert and I talked, really talked. He shared his background, growing up in a small, predominantly white town, never really interacting with people of color until he moved to the city for work. He spoke about his fears and insecurities, how he felt threatened by what he perceived as preferential treatment for minorities. I listened, really listened, and then I shared my own experiences. The subtle discrimination I'd faced throughout my career, the extra effort I always felt I had to put in to prove myself. I told him about the pride I felt in serving my country, and the pain of feeling like some people still didn't see me as a true American because of the color of my skin. As we talked, I could see something changing in Robert's eyes. The defensiveness was fading, replaced by understanding and, dare I say it, empathy. "I never realized," he said at one point, his voice choked with emotion, "I never thought about how my actions might affect someone else. I was so caught up in my own perspective that I couldn't see yours." It was a powerful moment, one that filled me with a sense of hope. But our conversation was just the beginning. As we wrapped up our meeting, we were surprised to find a small crowd had gathered outside the room. There were community leaders, fellow veterans, and even a few local politicians. They had heard about our meeting and wanted to be part of the conversation. What happened next was something I never could have predicted. Our private conversation turned into an impromptu town hall. People from all walks of life shared their experiences, their fears, and their hopes for a more inclusive society. Robert, to his credit, stayed and listened to every story. I watched as he engaged in conversations with people he might never have spoken to before. It wasn't always comfortable. There were heated moments and difficult truths shared, but it felt important, necessary. As the evening wore on, a local news crew arrived. They asked if they could film the discussion, and after a quick consultation with the group, we agreed. This was a conversation that needed to be heard beyond the walls of this community center. I found myself in front of the camera, Robert by my side. The reporter asked us to share our thoughts on what had transpired. "What started as a misunderstanding on a flight has turned into something much bigger," I said, looking directly into the camera. "It's shown us that we still have work to do as a nation, but it's also shown the power of open, honest dialogue. Mr. Carlson and I come from different backgrounds, but we found common ground in our shared humanity." Robert nodded, adding, "I made a mistake, a big one. But Sergeant Johnson gave me the chance to learn and grow. I hope our story can inspire others to have these difficult conversations and challenge their own biases." As we finished the interview, I felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a weight of responsibility. This story had resonated with so many people, and I knew it had the potential to make a real difference. Over the next few days, our story continued to spread. The airline reached out, asking if Robert and I would be willing to participate in a new diversity and inclusion training program for their staff. Civil rights organizations invited us to speak at their events. Schools asked if we could share our experience with their students. It was overwhelming, but also incredibly inspiring. Every day I received messages from people who said our story had prompted them to reflect on their own biases or to stand up against discrimination they'd witnessed. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came a week after the incident, when I received a call from my commanding officer. He informed me that the military was launching a new initiative to address racial bias within its ranks, and they wanted me to be part of the team developing the program. As I hung up the phone, I felt a mix of emotions: pride, hope, and a renewed sense of purpose. What had started as a difficult and humiliating experience had turned into an opportunity to make a real difference. That evening, as I sat with my family, I reflected on the whirlwind of the past week. Aisha, ever perceptive, asked, "Mom, do you think things will really change because of what happened?" I pulled her close, considering my words carefully. "Change doesn't happen overnight, sweetie. But every conversation, every person who decides to listen and learn, brings us one step closer to the world we want to see." What happened on that flight was just the beginning. The real work starts now, with each of us doing our part every day. As I looked around at my family, at John's supportive smile, at Marcus's wide-eyed curiosity, at Aisha's thoughtful expression, I felt a surge of determination. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was ready for the challenge. This experience had taught me that one voice, one story, could spark a movement. But it was up to all of us to keep that spark alive, to fan it into a flame of real, lasting change. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I thought about the man I'd encountered on the plane, not as an adversary, but as a reminder of the work still to be done. And I thought about all the people who had shared their stories, who had listened and learned. In that moment, I realized that my journey home hadn't ended when the plane landed. In many ways, it was just beginning. A journey towards understanding, towards equality, towards a better future for all of us. And as I closed my eyes, I made a silent promise to myself and to my children. I would continue this fight, not just as a soldier defending my country, but as a citizen working to make it live up to its highest ideals. Because in the end, that's what true service is all about. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of that fateful flight continued to ripple outward in ways I never could have imagined. What had started as a personal confrontation had evolved into a national conversation, and I found myself at the center of it all. The military's new initiative to address racial bias was gaining traction, and I was deeply involved in its development. We were creating training programs, facilitating discussions, and implementing policies that would hopefully make a real difference in the lives of service members from all backgrounds. One particularly memorable day, I was invited to speak at a conference in Washington, D.C. As I stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces, military personnel, politicians, civil rights leaders, I felt the weight of responsibility on my shoulders. I began my speech by recounting the incident on the plane, but I didn't dwell on the negative aspects. Instead, I focused on the transformation that had occurred, not just in Robert Carlson, but in the thousands of people who had been moved by our story. "This experience taught me that change is possible," I said, my voice carrying across the hushed auditorium. "But it requires courage. The courage to confront our biases, to listen to experiences different from our own, and to be willing to grow and evolve." As I spoke, I could see heads nodding, people leaning forward in their seats. I shared stories of the letters and messages I'd received, from a young Black girl who said she now felt inspired to join the military, from a white businessman who admitted he'd never considered how his actions might be perceived as racist, from a veteran who thanked me for giving voice to experiences he'd never felt able to share. "These conversations aren't easy," I continued. "They're often uncomfortable, sometimes painful. but they're necessary if we want to build a truly inclusive society, one that lives up to the ideals our nation was founded upon. As I concluded my speech, the room erupted in applause. But it wasn't the applause that moved me most. It was the conversations I overheard afterward, the people who approached me with tears in their eyes, eager to share their own stories or ask how they could make a difference. That evening, as I was preparing to head back to my hotel, I received an unexpected call. It was from the White House. The president had heard about my speech and wanted to meet with me to discuss the military's new initiatives and how they might be applied on a broader scale. I stood there, phone in hand, barely able to believe what I was hearing. From a confrontation on a plane to the White House, it seemed surreal. The meeting with the president was scheduled for the following week. In the days leading up to it, I threw myself into preparation, consulting with experts, gathering data, and refining my proposals. I wanted to make the most of this opportunity to effect real change. When the day finally arrived, I found myself standing in the Oval Office, face to face with the leader of the free world. The president greeted me warmly, thanking me for my service and for the work I'd been doing to address racial bias. We spent over an hour in deep discussion. I shared my experiences, both from the incident on the plane and from my years of military service. We talked about the challenges faced by people of color in the armed forces and in society at large. And we brainstormed ideas for how to create meaningful, lasting change. As our meeting drew to a close, the president made an announcement that left me speechless. He wanted to establish a national task force on racial equality and inclusion, and he wanted me to lead it. "Sergeant Johnson," he said, his voice filled with conviction, "your story has inspired millions. You've shown that one person can make a difference. I believe you have the vision and the leadership to help guide our nation towards a more just and equitable future." I left the White House that day feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. The task ahead was enormous, but I was ready to take it on. Over the next year, my life became a whirlwind of activity. The task force brought together leaders from various sectors: government, education, business, law enforcement, to develop comprehensive strategies for combating systemic racism and promoting inclusion. We traveled the country, holding town halls and listening sessions in communities large and small. We heard heartbreaking stories of discrimination and inspiring tales of resilience. We saw firsthand the deep divisions that still existed in our society, but also the genuine desire for change that burned in so many hearts. One of the most powerful moments came when we returned to my hometown. The community center where I'd met with Robert Carlson was packed to capacity. As I stood at the podium, I saw familiar faces, neighbors, old classmates, my children's teachers, all there to be part of this important conversation. I shared the progress we'd made and the challenges we still faced. But more importantly, I listened. I heard from people who'd lived in our town for generations and from recent immigrants, from those who'd experienced discrimination firsthand, and from those who were just beginning to understand their own privilege. As the evening wore on, something remarkable happened. People who might never have spoken to each other before were engaged in deep, meaningful conversations. They were sharing experiences, challenging assumptions, and finding common ground. At one point, an elderly white man stood up. His voice shaking with emotion, he admitted that he'd held racist beliefs for most of his life. But hearing the stories shared that night had opened his eyes. He turned to a young black woman sitting nearby and apologized, asking how he could do better. The room fell silent as the woman stood, tears in her eyes. She walked over to the man and embraced him. It was a powerful symbol of the healing and reconciliation that was possible when people opened their hearts and minds. As the task force's work progressed, we began to see tangible results. New legislation was passed to address racial disparities in education, healthcare, and criminal justice. Companies implemented more inclusive hiring practices. Schools revised their curricula to include a more comprehensive and honest portrayal of our nation's history. But perhaps the most significant change was the shift in national conversation. People were talking about race and racism more openly, more honestly than ever before. It wasn't always comfortable, but it was necessary. Throughout it all, I never forgot where this journey had started. On a plane, with a confrontation that could have ended very differently. I often thought about Robert Carlson and the transformation he'd undergone. One day, out of the blue, I received an email from him. He'd been following the work of the task force and wanted to share his own progress. He'd become an advocate for racial equality in his workplace, leading diversity and inclusion initiatives and mentoring young professionals of color. I never imagined that my worst moment would lead to my greatest growth, he wrote. Thank you for having the courage to stand up to me and the compassion to help me understand. You've changed not just my life, but the lives of countless others. His words brought tears to my eyes. They were a powerful reminder that change was possible, that hearts and minds could be opened, that our nation could move towards a more just and equitable future. As I approach the end of my term leading the task force, I find myself reflecting on the incredible journey of the past few years. From a soldier simply trying to get home to my family, to a reluctant activist, to a leader helping to shape national policy. It's been a transformation I never could have anticipated. But the most profound change has been within myself. I've learned the power of my own voice, the impact that one person's story can have. I've seen firsthand how courage and compassion can break down barriers and build bridges. Most importantly, I've gained a deeper understanding of what it truly means to serve my country. It's not just about wearing a uniform or fighting on foreign soil. It's about working every day to make our nation live up to its highest ideals, liberty and justice for all. As I look to the future, I'm filled with hope. Not because I believe we've solved the problem of racism. We still have a long way to go. But because I've seen the change that's possible when people come together, when they're willing to listen and learn, when they have the courage to confront uncomfortable truths and the compassion to work towards healing. My journey began with a seat on a plane, but it's taken me, and our nation, so much further. And while the destination of true equality may still be on the horizon, I know now that every step we take brings us closer. So I'll keep walking, keep talking, keep working. Because that's what true service is all about. And I invite each and every one of you to join me on this journey. Together, we can build a future where everyone, regardless of the color of their skin, has a seat at the table, in first class, in the boardroom, in the halls of power, and everywhere in between. The flight may be over, but our journey continues. And I, for one, am excited to see where it takes us next. As my term leading the National Task Force on Racial Equality and Inclusion came to an end, I found myself at a crossroads. The work we had done had made significant strides, but I knew there was still so much more to accomplish. I couldn't shake the feeling that my journey was far from over. It was during this period of reflection that I received an unexpected invitation. A major news network wanted to produce a documentary series about my experiences and the broader issues of racial equality in America. At first, I was hesitant. I had never sought the spotlight, and the idea of having cameras follow me around made me uncomfortable. But then I thought about all the people who had shared their stories with me over the years, and how powerful those stories had been in changing hearts and minds. After discussing it with my family, I decided to accept the offer. If my story could continue to make a difference, I had a responsibility to share it. The filming process was intense. For months, a camera crew followed me as I continued my work, now as a private citizen rather than a government official. We traveled across the country, revisiting key moments and places from my journey. One of the most powerful segments was when we returned to the airport where it all began. As I walked through the terminal, memories flooded back. I could almost hear the echoes of that confrontation, the tension in the air, the shocked faces of fellow passengers. But this time, something was different. As we filmed, people began to recognize me. A group of young soldiers approached, asking for a photo. An elderly couple stopped to thank me for my service, not just military service, but my work for equality. A flight attendant shared how my story had inspired her company to revamp their training programs. It was a stark reminder of how far we'd come, but also of how much work still lay ahead. For every person who expressed support, there were others who watched from a distance, their expressions guarded or even hostile. The divisions in our society were still very real. The documentary series also gave me the opportunity to reconnect with people who had played significant roles in my journey. We arranged a reunion with Robert Carlson, the man from the original flight incident. Meeting him again in the same airport where our confrontation had taken place was surreal. Robert had continued his own journey of growth and advocacy. He had become a respected voice in corporate diversity initiatives, using his experience as a cautionary tale and a call to action. As we sat down to talk, the cameras capturing our conversation, I was struck by how much we had both changed. "You know," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion, "I wake up every day grateful for that flight. It was the worst moment of my life, but it led to the best version of myself." We talked about the ripple effects of that day, how it had changed not just our lives, but the lives of countless others. Robert shared stories of employees he'd mentored, of policies he'd helped change. I told him about the task force, about the people I'd met across the country who were fighting for equality in their own communities. As our conversation drew to a close, Robert looked at me intently. "Tamara," he said, using my first name for the first time, "I want you to know that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends for what I did that day. Not just to you, but to everyone who's ever felt the sting of discrimination." I reached out and took his hand. "Robert," I replied, "the best amends you can make is to keep doing exactly what you're doing. Keep learning, keep growing, keep helping others do the same." The cameras captured our embrace, a powerful symbol of reconciliation and hope. As the documentary series progressed, we delved deeper into the systemic issues underlying racial inequality in America. We visited underfunded schools in inner-city neighborhoods, spoke with families affected by discriminatory housing policies, and interviewed activists working tirelessly for change. One particularly memorable segment took us to a small town in the Deep South, where racial tensions had recently boiled over into violent protests. The town was deeply divided, with long-standing racial segregation still evident in housing patterns and social interactions. We organized a town hall meeting, bringing together people from all sides of the issue. The atmosphere was tense from the start, with angry voices and accusatory fingers pointing in all directions. For a moment, I feared we had made a mistake in coming here. But then something remarkable happened. A young white woman stood up, her voice shaking as she addressed an elderly black man. She spoke about how she had grown up believing in racial stereotypes, never questioning the segregation she saw around her. But recent events had forced her to confront her own biases. With tears in her eyes, she apologized, not just for her own past beliefs, but for the generations of hurt and discrimination that had been inflicted on the Black community. The elderly man listened silently, then slowly stood up. He walked over to the young woman and, in a gesture that left the room breathless, he hugged her. It wasn't a magical solution to centuries of racial strife, but it was a start. As the meeting continued, more people began to open up, to listen to each other, to acknowledge past wrongs, and discuss ways to move forward. By the end of our time in that small town, tentative plans were in place for a community reconciliation project. It was a small step, but a significant one. As we packed up our equipment to leave, I couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. Change was possible, even in the most unlikely places. As the documentary series neared completion, I found myself reflecting on the incredible journey I had been on. From that fateful flight to the White House, from leading a national task force to now sharing my story with millions through this series, it had been a transformation I never could have imagined. The final episode of the series brought me back home, As I sat in my living room, surrounded by my family, watching the culmination of our work, I felt a profound sense of gratitude and responsibility. The series ended with a call to action, not just from me, but from the many voices we had featured throughout. It was a call for continued dialogue, for active engagement in creating a more equitable society, for the courage to confront our own biases and the compassion to help others do the same. As the credits rolled, my phone began to buzz with messages. Friends, fellow soldiers, strangers from across the country, all reaching out to share how the series had impacted them. Some were pledging to get more involved in their communities. Others were sharing their own stories of discrimination or awakening. Still others were asking how they could help carry the work forward. In that moment, I realized that while one chapter of my journey might be ending, another was just beginning. The documentary series wasn't just a recounting of past events, it was a launchpad for future action. In the days and weeks that followed the series airing, I found myself busier than ever. Speaking engagements, community organizing, advising on policy initiatives. The work seemed endless, but deeply fulfilling. One particularly meaningful project emerged from an unexpected quarter. A group of tech entrepreneurs reached out, inspired by the series, to create a platform for sharing stories of racial experiences and promoting dialogue. They asked me to be an advisor, to help ensure the platform would be a force for positive change, rather than just another echo chamber. As we worked on developing the platform, I was struck by the potential of technology to bridge divides and create understanding. Through this app, people from all walks of life could share their experiences, learn from others, and engage in meaningful conversations about race and equality. But perhaps the most profound impact was closer to home. My children, who had watched this journey unfold from the beginning, were now young adults with their own passions for social justice. Aisha had become involved in education reform, working to address racial disparities in schools. Marcus was studying law, determined to fight for civil rights in the courtroom. Watching them take up this mantle, in their own unique ways, filled me with a pride deeper than any military honor I had ever received. They were the living embodiment of the change I had been fighting for. A new generation committed to building a more just and equitable world. As I sit here now, years after that flight that changed everything, I am filled with a mix of emotions. There's pride in how far we've come, frustration at how far we still have to go, hope for the future, and a deep, abiding commitment to continue this work for as long as I'm able. The journey that began with a confrontation over an airline seat has taken me places I never could have imagined. It's shown me the worst of humanity, the ugly face of racism and discrimination. But it's also shown me the best, the capacity for growth, for compassion, for real and lasting change. I've learned that change doesn't happen in grand, sweeping gestures. It happens in small moments, in difficult conversations, in the daily choice to stand up for what's right. It happens when we have the courage to confront our own biases and the compassion to help others confront theirs. As I look to the future, I don't see an end to this journey. The work of creating a truly equitable society is never done. But I do see hope. I see it in the young activists taking to the streets, in the corporate leaders reimagining their companies, in the educators reshaping curricula, in the everyday people having difficult but necessary conversations. And so, I'll keep moving forward. I'll keep sharing my story, keep fighting for change, keep believing in the possibility of a better world. Because that's what true service is all about. Not just wearing a uniform, but working every day to make our nation live up to its highest ideals. The flight that started this journey may have ended long ago, but the voyage towards equality continues. And I, for one, am committed to seeing it through, no matter how long it takes. Because in the end, we're all on this flight together, and we all deserve a seat in first class.